Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for what promises to be an engaging session on building cyber confidence. My name is Linoy Barkai. I'm an Associate Director with SRM Cybersecurity Team, and I'll be hosting today's session. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our expert panel. From law firm Mullen Coughlin, we have partner and breach counsel Carolyn, Ryan. Gus de los Reyes joins us as the Chief Information Security Officer of Brown Advisory. John Felker is a Senior Advisor to SRM and former Assistant Director for Integrated Operations at the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, joining us from his very mobile office. John Gracey is Chief Security Officer at Options Technology, and David Ortiz is Chief Information Security Officer for Church and Dwight. Thank you, all of you, very much for joining us today. Combined, our panelists boast decades of experience working at both the front lines and the high strategic levels of cybersecurity. So really looking forward to hearing your insights. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. So we have 3 topics that we'll be running through during the session, with about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So to all the attendees, you should see a questions function on GoToWebinar on the panel, the GoToWebinar panel, which you can use to submit your questions as we go through the session. So please post those questions at any time, and at the end of the session, myself and Georgina, who's working our technology in the back end, will collate them and ask the panelists. You'll also find SRM's latest report on building cyber confidence in the handout section of GoToWebinar. So we'd encourage you to download that if you're interested in more insights around this topic. And then finally, we will be using a number of interactive elements in this webinar. So with that, I would like to introduce our first audience poll. Georgina, can you please call up the first poll? Okay, so please indicate your company's cyber maturity level. So this will help our panelists get a feel for who is in the room and will also assist in setting a bit of the tone for the conversation. While you're voting, as you know, the theme of our discussion today is building cyber confidence. But what do we actually mean by that? Well, what we're exploring here is really a measure of how large the gap is between how you might feel about your cybersecurity posture's effectiveness and its actual effectiveness. So if you have good cyber confidence, it means that you understand your security posture, you feel good about your security posture, and your security posture is indeed good. So it is a combination of both a technical, I suppose, and psychological theme that we're looking to explore during the session. Georgina, if we have enough poll results, let's look at who's in the room with us. Okay, right, so the majority are self-rated as growing and established, 20% mature and 2% beginners. So panelists, hopefully that gives you a good idea as to who our audience is. And with that in mind, I want to introduce our first topic of discussion, which relates to governance and leadership. So this is going to be the first of 3 polls that are topic specific. So we're going to ask you to vote one more time if you don't mind. Georgina, please can you call up the leadership and governance poll? Right. So what level of understanding does your corporate leadership have about the risks that cybersecurity presents to your business? As you vote, I'm going to open the discussion with our panelist. John Felker, perhaps you can kick off the discussion. So whose responsibility ultimately is cybersecurity?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, Linoy. And in this question, we point out what level of understanding does your corporate leadership have? And my view is that if we ask the question, whose responsibility is cybersecurity, I would first say no. Really go without saying. We all have an element of it, whether we're just doing accounting or whatever, or whether we're into the cyber defense element of an organization. We all have responsibility for doing it. Users are just a bigger problem as outside threats are. But But aside from that, I think the corporate leadership piece is something that we've lost, or we may have never had over the last 5 to 10 years. My view is that corporate leadership needs to own this problem. They need to understand what the issues are. They need to know where their high value assets are within their organization, and they need to take steps to assess the risk with those high value assets, and then set their defenses up in accordance with how they've determined that risk. And remember, there's other elements to this too. It's not about always completely risk of cyber threat. It's risk to the business. And how do those two things fit together when you're assessing the risk against high value assets? So the question is, whose responsibility is it outside of everyone? My view is that it's leadership's responsibility, and you really need to make sure that if you're a leader in an organization, that you understand that. And you don't have to get down into the weeds. You don't have to put your hands on the keyboard, but you really need to understand the larger impacts of threat against risk and what your risk is in terms of the high value assets in your organization.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. You know, it's a responsibility of everyone within an organization. But you're really, you know, it's like a driving analogy. You know, you can have the safest car, you can have the best technologies, but you're really only as safe as the person driving the car. You know, how recklessly they're going to drive a car, etc. So yeah, you certainly need to have leadership, you know, deciding the structure, the strategies. They need to be underpinning everything, but it absolutely comes down to everyone in an organization, from the person, you know, cleaning the canteen tables, right the way through to the CEO, to the security architect, to the receptionist. Everyone plays a part, because there are many different ways that an incident can happen. It can be technical, it can be personal, etc., etc. So everyone has to play their role, you know, even down to making sure that the person following you into the office, if you're doing a delivery, that you're not being tailgated, etc. So it's critical that everyone plays their part.
John, that's an excellent point. I think one of the other things I hear from a lot of clients is, well, why would they want my stuff, right? It's always the big ones in the news. It's not me. Why would they want any of my information? And to be very honest, that's unfortunately not true, right? We have small clients, medium-sized clients, and yeah, there are large clients, of course, that are affected on a daily basis by these kind of instances. But you're absolutely right. The first line of defense comes from the bottom up. Having a full understanding as to what's going on with your environment, especially because when you have instances occur, and even from a top high level, you're also going to be having to answer to your customers and to your clients when those kind of situations occur. So again, we want to be thinking about, okay, what are the common attack vectors, right? You got your phishing emails, you've got your people on the front lines, right? Clicking on everything and potentially getting into the environment. But it's also important from the higher level to have an understanding, because, I will tell you this, there's regulators that are out there, especially in, you've got your New York regulations, your Massachusetts regulations, that in the event of an incident that occurs and you have to provide notification, they'll be asking you about your security program. So all the more importance across the board for everybody within the organization to have an understanding and to stress the importance of cyber within their organization, and talk about how, these kind of things happen on a daily basis. I mean, one of the things that I hear all the time is, oh, well, it might not be in the budget. But there are things, and I'm sure John and everybody on this call could talk about, yeah, sure, you could have the most robust systems in the world, but there are also simple things that you could be doing from a preliminary standpoint that are on the less expensive end that to implement in order to thwart some of these activities.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I agree with that. And I think to concentrate on leadership, again, I think it's very important that the leadership basically walks the talk, because they can say that security is important and mention that and everything, but it really comes down to when things happen. So when you say, well, we don't really want to use this vendor because they're not secure enough for us, and they say, well, we want to because we have some kind of an interest in them, or we've been using them a long time, everything like that, that's when these decisions get made. And people see that. People see that the leadership really is supporting your security, or they're just talking about security, supporting your security. And I think that's very important. So the tone gets set at the top and then flows down.
So those are all really great points, and saying it's everyone's responsibility is right. And then as well as on the leadership side, one component here that sometimes may be overlooked is communication with your consumer or your customer, right? The last thing we want to be doing is communicating about security when there's an incident, right? As opposed to before there's an incident, right? We take security seriously, and we want to make sure that there's an open line of communication, that, hey, do these things because we want to keep you safe and we want everything to be secure.
Absolutely. And David, it brings up an excellent point. Not only just that, but your clients may require you to have a level of security, right? Take a look at, I could talk about the state and federal laws. I could talk about how in New York, some of the financial regulations require you to notify within 72 hours. I could sit here and talk about educational institutions that are under Title IV with the, higher education, that you have to notify the FSA and potentially Department of Education within a day of a suspected incident. We could talk about all of that, but what about your contractual obligations? Those are the kinds of things that, a lot of, companies and their vendors that they work with sometimes have a contractual obligation to notify of a suspected incident, and also have more expansive definitions when it comes to, personal identifiable information that may be at issue, and whether or not, confidentiality is breached. So it's also something to be thinking about it in terms of a preliminary conversation as well.
Yes.
And I think just a quick story to bring both everybody's responsibility and leadership walking the walk together. One of the senior incident response folks that used to work in my organization in DHS, one of the top control system experts, security experts in the world, in the top 10 anyway, he got fooled by a phishing email. And he got halfway through before he figured out what was going on, and he stopped. And to his credit, not only did he start putting remedial steps in place, but he also self-reported up the chain. So everybody in his organization knew, hey, it can happen to anybody. And he was willing to take responsibility for doing that. So that's a leader in my mind that is willing to say, hey, look, I screwed up too, but this is all of our responsibility.
Absolutely. And that's the thing is too, these threat actors are really sophisticated. They've got, these emails that come through, I've seen some of them. I would have clicked, I would have clicked on it. They're very believable in nature. I mean, some of the things that happened over the summer where they were attaching it to an email, right? And then you were to click to, re-enter in your credentials, or ones that, were directed from the HR department, right? That's a very, very common one. And it says like, oh, well, hey, look, would you want to hear about COVID testing? That was a large one that happened over the past couple of months. And then, of course, you're going to click on something from your HR, right? So again, having that educational piece, and just incentivizing it, I mean, I think both pieces of it is, just you want to encourage people to be able to be upfront with you, because you want to be able to be in a safe space, because a lot of people are afraid to say anything in the event of potentially being penalized as a result of it. You don't want that for your organization. You want to have everybody be a level of comfortability and want people to be upfront about things, so then you can jump on things right away, because there's nothing worse than a prolonged situation.
It's an interesting point. One of the, I think it's probably under talked about, but one of the real security leaders out there are people who are trying to change the mindset of staff, that it's not something that, security isn't something that you have to do and you have to do compliance training every year, etc. It's something that people should understand protects them. Security frameworks are in place to protect the organization. People are part of that organization. The protections, the controls, the training, they are there to protect the users as just every bit as much as the actual company itself. When users are safe, companies are safe. So it's kind of a case of making that, and we'll talk about it a bit later, the cultural side of things, but it's really making that transition from people thinking that security is something being enforced upon them, to making that mindset change and having that leadership that security is something that they actively want to participate in, that they see the benefit, that they can relate the benefits of what they're learning in the office to, you know, their own personal lives, to what they're doing in social media, you know, what they're doing with personal protections, etc. You know, the training that that people can get, it certainly transcends just the corporate estate. If you can get people's mindsets changed, if the right leadership can make people look at security in the right framework.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? And our boundary extended over the last year with having to give guidance for people working remotely, right? People are not in the office, people are working from home or from somewhere else, and our guidances and our boundaries have shifted, right? We've always said these things, but now it's personal and professional at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing. That's an excellent point, David, is people talk about that a lot. Well, it might not be in the budget. There, you know what I mean? You know, there's, especially with a lot of people having to work remotely, I know some security measures have had to be, you know, end run and cut around as a result. But it's also, you know, based on what everybody has said, one of the thing is we also want people to be upfront about it, because it might not be an incident, right? It might not be as bad as people think, but you want to take a look into it. You want to make sure that you work with the right experts in the event that something does happen. You want to make sure to jump on it very quickly. And to also print out your incident response plan and actually test it, right? Because it's worth nothing if it's up in the cloud. You know, I get that a lot. Is, well, your phone number, you know, it's like kind of like losing your cell phone, right? You lose all the numbers in there, and then you're left without nothing. So print it out, like going backwards from technology.
Thanks everyone. I think now might be a good opportunity to have a look at our poll results quickly. Georgina, do you want to call them up? Okay, so we have around 50% with a good understanding, which I think is a pretty good result. Limited understanding 11%, deep understanding 38%, and 0% poor understanding, which is quite interesting. Just as we move from the leadership and governance topic, I have a bridging question, which is, how would the panel suggest that we can effectively communicate the threat picture to senior stakeholders, especially when we're constantly bombarded with narratives around how complex and intractable it is? Gus or David, perhaps one of you could answer.
Yep, I think it's less of an understanding problem these days, because for example, on our leadership and on the board, most of these folks, they run their own company or they're on other boards and they see what's going on. So I think telling people that security is important is not such a big deal anymore. But as you said, Linoy, how do you explain that these things are going to happen? I think the only way to do that is when smaller events happen, you bring them up and you say, look, this happened and this is what, and we caught it, and it, you know, maybe it was a laptop that got compromised or desktop or something like that. You don't wait until there's a major event and then they say, whoa, what happened here? We had nothing and now we had this. You have to kind of make aware that these things are happening all the time. People are clicking on phishing emails. All these things are happening. And then I think when you bring this constant what's going on, it also brings leadership and awareness of what's going on in their own firm. And this is normal. You show articles, and maybe when you read articles that are very popular, because a lot of these articles now in cybersecurity are all over, right? So maybe you send a copy or a snippet of that to the leadership and you say, look, this is what's happening. This is what we're doing to protect against this. So I think all those things of a lot of communication that someone mentioned earlier is very important. And so if unfortunately you have a bigger incident, then it's not that they're inured to it, but they say, oh, okay, we know you know how to react to it, go ahead and do it. Oh, you're on.
Classic, I'm on mute moment. It was bound to happen. On that note, I think let's bring up our second theme poll, which is all about understanding our adversaries in the cyber landscape. Georgina, please can you call it up for us? Right, so when it comes to the cyber threat landscape, how clearly do you understand your adversaries? So if the audience can please take a moment to vote. Meanwhile, I'll open the first question of our second topic, which is the threat picture, which is, what are some of the challenges you have observed that security professionals face in getting the threat intelligence that they need?
Well,
Yes.
I'll jump in here. I hope you don't get tired of hearing me, but anyway, I think I look at threat intelligence in kind of two different buckets. The one you read a lot about is, who are these adversaries? Are they nation states, foreign, companies, rogue, all these things doing that? And that gets a lot of the attention, and it's very important. But a firm like ours, a smaller, medium firm, we're not really staffed to do all that kind of work. I mean, that takes hundreds of people or dozens of people to keep up on that. So in that area, we rely quite a bit on partners. And we rely on partners for much of our security. Actually, they're an extended part of our firm. And so they are looking at those things, all these advanced attacks and who's doing it and what their modus operandi are. And then they're updating their tools and their surveillance to make sure that we're protected. Then the other bucket, and they're not completely separate, but the other bucket is, what do we, our firm, have to do on a daily basis to make sure that we're keeping up? So, we keep up on open intelligence, on law enforcement mailing lists that we're on. And so, for example, now we see that there's a new zero-day attack, and a patch just came out. And so we have to do. So that's something that we have to react very quickly, because we have to do that. Or there's some new attacks that are taking advantage of some patches. We have to check, are we patched against all these patches and things like that? So as a small firm, we can keep up with those daily things. And those are things like, vendor reports, other kind of open intelligence that comes in daily that tells us, hey, these attacks are going on. You're vulnerable. Are you vulnerable to these things? And then our partners that we rely on for the very time-consuming, very intensive, honestly, things that would be beyond our reach of being able to do. So that's the way we treat security intelligence.
It's absolutely vital, Gus. Like, the amount of threat intelligence out there, the amount of information on Twitter, on social media, via email from vendors, it's very easy to be overwhelmed with the sheer volume of information that's coming in. What we have found is the most critical thing that we have to have in place is a full understanding of what our state is, what vendors we have, what technologies we use, because that instantly allows you to separate the wheat from the chaff. That allows you to go, hey, the news is breaking about this item. It's all over the news. It's all over Twitter, and you're sitting there going, well, we don't use that technology. That technology is not in our state. You can't go off and try and find whether or not you use that technology after the news breaks. That's part of your preparation. You have to know what technologies you have before this happens, so that you can instantly tell that, it's 3 a.m. I don't need to do anything with this tonight. I can look at this again tomorrow, because I can get communications out to my clients. I can do all this sort of thing. You can then instantly send out those communications. Not only your organization understands where they are, but your clients also understand. Quite often, before they've even heard the news breaking, you can be in a position that you've notified your clients that they're not at risk, or that's not applicable. And if it is applicable, if there is a technology that the 0-day is applied to, you can immediately go back, and I think it goes back to what Carolyn was saying about practice. Just practice, practice, practice. You invoke your response processes. You make sure that you know exactly what it is you need to do in order to take that intelligence and turn it into actionable activities, so that, again, by the next morning, you're not missing any tricks, you're not delaying anything. So for me, separating how you would analyze that intelligence all comes down to doing your homework before and understanding, your state, your vendors, where your data is. Is your data in AWS? Is it in a private cloud? Is it in Azure? What it's been used by, what applications are accessing it. Know your controls, know what controls, because quite often 0 days, there may be 0 days, but you also might have mitigating or compensating controls in there. You need to understand all of this. If you don't know these before a 0-day lands, you have to treat every 0 day, every threat that comes through in intelligence. You have to analyze them all, and you have to respond to them all as if you do have that. And then you're not going to need dozens or hundreds. You're going to need a small army of people to do that.
Sure, absolutely. And that actually brings up, a very important point about, like, the technology aspect of things, about knowing thyself, Know where you've got your golden ticket items. Know where, know where these threat actors, what are the threat actors going to go for first, right? Where is your personal identifiable information? Where's your health information? And your backups. Oh my goodness, how we could spend hours talking about backups, right? So if you could have them separate apart, and by the way, test them, because I know somebody had said to me the other day, oh, we've got the best backups in the world. And you know what? The last time that they had made sure that they were running was 6 months ago. And you know what? Then you're losing all of that data in the potential of a ransomware incident where you're locked out, and you want to go and you test the viability of your backups. But that's one of the first things that these threat actors go for is the backups. They wipe their logs, they wipe their traces. But one of the things also is, when you're talking about know thyself, can you remove your legacy protocols? Like, do you have them in place? Are you having all of your software updates? But let's just say this, let's say you're in a position where you're going through a ransomware attack. And you talk about the threat intelligence, Gus. You talked about the threat intelligence and knowing well what's out there. Because I mean, when you take a look at these threat actors and the people that are out there, okay, well, NetWalker went down 2 weeks ago. Yeah, we were all so excited, right? But it changes, and then there's variants that pop up all the time. And staying on top of that and having an understanding also. What's very, very important, we have a number of clients that are out there that get locked out of their systems. We all remember back in the day when ransomware was lock you out and extort you for cash. Now it's lock you out, extort you for cash, and steal your data, right? So, what if you're left in a situation where you might have to pay, like where your backups are completely encrypted and are completely unusable, and you need to get back up running for a business standpoint? I know, John, you were talking about that earlier. What do we need to know in terms of our business? What do we might have to make that decision. But in terms of threat intelligence, what's also very important is if you're left in a situation where you might have to make payment, you also want to make sure that you're in abidance by all the laws and the regulations and the advisories that are out there. You take a look at OFAC and FinCEN from last year, the advisory that came out. It stressed a lot of what we knew already, but it also stressed the importance of, hey, look, when it comes to these threat actors and the activities, you need to be taking a look at, number one, making sure that, the payments to threat actors, you don't want to be funding terrorism, right? So you want to make sure that none of these threat actors in terms of a payment, if you do have to make the payment, unfortunately, if you do, which we never encourage, but sometimes you're in that situation where you might have to, but make sure they're not on the sanctions list. Are you checking the UN, Security Council sanctions list? Are you checking the OFAC list? Are you checking the EU financial sanctions list? Are you making sure to take a look at the forensic and the intelligence that's out there? You're taking a look at to see whether or not, Dridex and Doppelpaymer and the risk associated with it, and whether or not it's both in the system. What about this, proprietary threat intelligence that's out there? Indicators of compromise, keeping in line of all of these activities and making sure that about the technologies that are out there. Again, what if you do have to make payment? What if, partners that are out there, making sure that they're money service business and MSC with a current license with FinCEN. Filing the suspicious activity reports and STAR reports, and also, communicating with the FBI, making sure that we have, working together in all of this is also really important. And again, just bringing all the pieces of technology all together.
Yeah, those are great points, right? And using that threat intelligence wisely to try to make that decision. Do I make this payment or do I not make this payment? Can I use that threat intelligence to say, look, this is possibly part of a larger campaign where if I pay once, I'm going to end up paying twice, and then I'm going to pay 3 times because it's going to come around and around again and again. How can you use that threat intelligence effectively? And it might not just be what you're focused on, but at that point, you need to go to information sharing and go broader to your network to see if it is impacting not only your company, but your industry as well.
Absolutely. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, number one, if I make payment, are they going to come back and ask for more, right? And those are the kind of things that we ask. Or if I do make payment, are they going to come after me again? Like there's so many different questions that we get, and they're good questions, but all the more reliance upon the threat intelligence that's out there and for all of us to work together.
Yes.
An interesting use for some threat intelligence feeds is that we would use occasionally is, a lot of people want to do tabletop exercise, a lot of people want to practice things, et cetera, but how do you come up with a scenario that gives a true representation of a genuine threat, a genuine 0-day? Yeah, you can plan to do a tabletop exercise next Tuesday at 9 a.m. when you know that everyone that you need is around and available. But if you take one of those 0 days, hopefully one that's not applicable to your estate, and you go, well, what if this were applicable to my estate? If this was landing at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning when, on a public holiday, what would I actually do? There's a great lesson to be learned in there if you use these. We all know that auditors and due diligence questionnaires, etc., all ask about your test regimes. Threat intelligence is a great source of simulation information. It's scenarios. So it's not just necessarily that threat intelligence can be applicable or not applicable. You can really benefit from seeing how you would respond to these things, even if it's only 15 minutes to go, you know what, do I have all the phone numbers of the people that I need to contact? Do I have the calling trees? If I take the next 15 minutes and look at this news article, look at this piece of information coming through, what am I going to do in the next 15 minutes that's going to make a tangible difference to the threat to my organization? Now, that's an interesting exercise. It doesn't take weeks preparation. It just takes 15 minutes.
Yeah.
On that note, I think, Regina, do you want to call up the poll results and we can see how confident our audience is on understanding the threat landscape? Okay, so 50% of our audience feels that they only partially are able to see or understand their adversaries. 35% feel like they can see their adversaries clearly, and 11% very clearly. Would any of the panelists like to comment on that split? What does that reflect in terms of your experiences?
Well, I'd point out that that's in line with my experience, and the reason I say that is two parts. First, it goes back to something that I think it was John or David said earlier, is really understanding what the threat is in some sort of detail. But there's this thought out there that as Gus said earlier, to process threat intelligence well, you needed a team of seasoned professionals to really understand what that means compared to your estate, as John would say. And I find that a lot of people, A, don't have that understanding, and B, they get sold. They have somebody that comes in and says, hey, we're going to sell you threat intelligence, going to solve all your problems. And that's just not the case. They're going to take your money and they're going to dump a bunch of stuff on you, and then you've got to do something with it. So that understanding of what it is hampered by the fact that you've got a ton of data coming at you now, and you really haven't got the professionals, the skills, or the tools in many cases to be able to use that. I'll point out an experience on the opposite end of the spectrum in late 2017, probably late summer 2017. As is typical, my organization had some intelligence about the threat actor behaving badly. And we knew exactly where that threat actor was behaving badly. It was in the United States electric grid. And so what we did based on that intelligence is we started making contact. It was a shared responsibility between us and the FBI. We started making contact with the three players that we saw this threat actor acting in. Two of them didn't know that threat actor was there. One of them had just figured it out and was starting to take some remedial steps. But the bottom line is that intelligence led us to those three players that ended up eventually being five. We thought at one stage it was going to be as many as 30 players in the U.S. electric grid that were going to be impacted by this particular actor. But that threat intelligence allowed us, as Gus said earlier, David said earlier, that what else is happening in our sector? Who else in our space is being impacted by this particular threat? And so being able to put that together and understand who was doing what to whom allowed us to do two things. Allowed us to put remedial measures in place in the five where we know that there were hits. It also allowed us to share that information more broadly to any, more than 30, probably 60 or 70. Hey, we know that this has happened. This is how they did it, and this is what you need to do about it. And that's really the true value of threat intelligence. And it gets back to having professionals that know what the heck they're doing and then are able to put it in place.
Well, that's a good point, John.
Sorry, go ahead, Carolyn.
Oh, no, all I was going to say is that, again, when you're talking about some of these threat actors, and it changes a lot, right? There's so many different threat actors that are out there. But one of the important things is also with all that threat intelligence is also it helps you in your potential forensic process as well, right? Like, because then you'll be able to see potentially about whether or not, how do we know that they got in there? Are these the common threat actors that utilize, phishing attempts, or are they ones that, potentially attack your remote desktop protocol or your openness to the internet? So again, these are kind of things that working together, not only just, I know the local FBI offices take a look at the variants that are associated that are out there, but also the threat intelligence to see like, okay, are these the kind of threat actors, the ones that like to post data? And what kind of data do they like to post? Do they, in the communications with these threat actors, do they, are they ones where you're utilizing a Tor site? Are they going to encrypt all of your files? Are they going to go after the logs associated with it? Are they going to infect all the way down to the BMDKs? Like, those are the kinds of things that as we, understand more and more about the variants are very important to the forensic process and the remediation process to get, clients back up and running when these kind of bad situations occur.
And John,
everyone wants to comment. Yes, John, Gracey, go ahead.
I was just going to say about John, what John was saying there about, sometimes government agencies or agencies knowing about these things before the organizations themselves. There are government programs that an organization can sign up to. In the UK, there's the NCSC CIS partnership, where you can actually have a registration with some organizations, some government organizations. And if they see your company domain name or they see an IP address that you've registered with them as being related to your organization, they will know and be able to proactively send you alerts if anything appears on the dark web. There's commercial dark web monitoring products which are allow you to identify whether or not someone, your CEO's email address has popped up in a chat room somewhere, etc. There are many different types of feeds. There's generic feeds, there's those subscription feeds, but there are some really good focused feeds that can either be purchased commercially or are available for subscription from various agencies that organizations should definitely look at.
Thanks, John.
And so we have this threat intelligence, and how can we use the threat intelligence to better exercise our capability and keep it a little bit more focused? You can do, like as John said earlier, you can do a tabletop exercise, and talk about the high level stuff all day long. But when you have some decent threat intelligence, when you can use that information to pinpoint some of the vulnerabilities in your process, you can design, as John said, a 15-minute exercise. It's very, very useful. In the NKIC, we used to call those 15-minute jobs just a drill, and we did those drills constantly, 24/7. The bigger exercises then puts a bunch of those together and then test the performance of your organization. So it makes it much more realistic when we're going down that path as well.
John, that was perfect. That is an excellent segue to our next audience poll. So thank you for that comment. Georgina, can you please call it up? We're moving on to our final topic of the session, which is all about response and recovery. And the question for the audience is, how rigorous and realistic are your incident response exercises? So please take a moment to respond. And as you do, David, what are some of the common pitfalls that you've observed that prevent effective incident response?
Yeah, the panel has touched on a lot of these already, right? Common pitfalls are not having a recent incident response plan in place, right? It's great that you had one. It should be recent, right? Not having trained technical and the leadership teams, another big point, and we've touched on that as well. And just not having the role clarity, right? As you do go through an exercise and you do go through a response, you want that muscle memory, right? You want that muscle memory recent. You don't want to be figuring that out for the first time. We've talked about it, and this should be up through crisis management communication, right? And the panel has said it, right? Engaging with counsel, outside legal counsel, law enforcement, regulatory bodies. These are some of the common pitfalls that, if you haven't gone through them recently, right, you're going to stumble on those mechanics during a live incident. And just lastly, right, and I think Carolyn may have said it, recovery capabilities, right, having those in place, having tested them, and making sure that you can test them. And when you do go to do a recovery, you understand how to do a prioritized recovery to get the business online, in the right places, so you can continue doing business.
And a question for Gus and maybe Carolyn, why is it important in a response to understand and negotiate the difference between privacy and security related issues?
I think they are related, of course, but they are different people that deal with them. So I'm the Chief Information Security Officer, and I have to make sure that adversaries can't get my data. But depending on what data they would be able to get, it matters who needs to get notified and what other actions you may need to take. So, if I don't even have an example, but maybe if just an email address was leaked or something like that, that may or may not have to get reported, depending again on the rules. And there's at least 50 state, laws, as well as many others. And Carolyn has much more experience in this than I do, but they are different. And so you have to make sure that when something happens, if you don't report it, there could be serious consequences as well.
Absolutely. And that, and it's important to also know what kind of, what regulations you need to be under, right? A lot of the times when you're thinking about this, you're thinking about industry-wise. Like, are we talking about a school district? Okay, well, if we're talking about school districts, or we're talking about, I mentioned FSA and that notification earlier. What about Department of Education, FERPA? Okay, well, what about the banking industry? We've got, not only just on the federal level, you got your GLBAs, you got the SEC if you're a publicly traded company. You have so many different regulations that are out there, but what about on the state level? Okay, well, you need to be thinking about the New York regulations that are out there. So there's so many different pieces and things going on, and so many different moving parts, and they all have different obligations. Like, for instance, what about whether or not you're the data owner versus the data processor? For instance, a lot of organizations that are out there don't actually own, or they might house the data on behalf of somebody else. They have very tight deadlines associated with it. And when it comes to personal identifiable information, each of the 50 states have their own set of definitions as to what is considered personal identifiable information. Like, for instance, in Washington State and North Dakota, dates of birth are considered personal identifiable information in those states, right? Some states out there consider biometrics to be consider personal identifiable information. Also, for instance, what about the Attorney General notification? Once you do have to notify individuals, a lot of the times you do have to notify them. In New Jersey, you have to notify the attorney, the Department of State of Police. You have to notify them in advance of notifying individuals. If you have an individual who resides in Puerto Rico, you need to notify them in 10 days. So there's all things and issues at play, and they're also quick too. I mean, some of the deadlines, like I was talking about, in terms of the FSA, that needs to be a suspected breach within 24 hours. What about if you have international? That's a whole other thing, right? I know a lot of people say, well, I'm not in, I don't have any, I'm not in the EU, so I don't have to worry about GDPR. Well, that, I could talk about that for an hour or so, but from there, you just need to be thinking about what kind of data that you have and what are the implications on it from a federal, state, and also a contractual obligation level. And those are the kind of things that you want to be thinking about in terms of the importance of it. But also from a preliminary standpoint, I know we talked about incident response, right? Like, making sure that you have the right people who need to make the right decisions, but also, and I'm not, like, hey, insurance, but things that you need to be thinking about: call your broker, know your insurance, because a lot of them have previously vetted forensics companies, breach coaches that they renegotiate rates for. Now, I mean, that's the reason why you have insurance, right? Those are the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about. And the worst time to be thinking about them is when you're locked out of your systems and can't find the piece of paper, right? And you can't, and then you're, potentially even, when you're working with forensics companies, maybe interview some in advance, right? Talk to some breach coaches in advance. Again, I will say that there's been some challenges to, forensic reports and things along the lines of that nature in terms of confidentiality and privilege associated with, forensic reporting and things along the lines of that nature. But again, working with a breach coach or someone who is an expert in the field, not only just from the insurance aspect of things, but also somebody who can guide you through and walk you through this process, ones that have familiarity with this. And ones that in the event of something occurring, they can guide you through the process. Like I'll tell you this, with breach coaches, what's very, very important is to be able to speak freely and openly. So a lot of the times when I get called, you get that 24/7 and these threat actors, they don't like to, do things on a Tuesday in the mid-afternoon. They like to do things on holidays in the middle of the night. And when you think that, somebody's away at the helm. So to be able to jump in and, a lot of, forensics companies, breach coaches, it's 24/7. So always feel free to call and jump in. But also the part of it is that I would be working with, forensics companies, and it's a tri-party agreement. I would be hiring a forensic company, right? This is them and others. But again, working with them, and also it's a tri-party agreement. So everything between us is confidential and privileged in nature. And all the more important, so then people can speak freely, and then we can dive into things and go forward. It's very important to be thinking about those things from a preliminary standpoint.
And back to something David said earlier too about the preparation. You got to exercise this process, and you got to include your breach coach, your legal counsel, your communications. And when you exercise this, you become good at it. And by exercise, I don't mean, we're just going to go through and check the boxes. We really need to exercise to the point of failure, because I think as a leader, you need to know where your organization needs to get things shored up and where they're good. And because when it happens, first of all, you don't want to be sharing business cards with your breach coach in the middle of a disaster. That's not the time to meet them. You meet them beforehand, and they're part of your preparation as you go through this whole process of incident response.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings up an excellent point, John. And just so, and I alluded to this a little bit, but, for anybody who would want to have an understanding about this, but again, there's been some challenges to forensic reporting, but all the more important to also have an understanding as to there's a difference between a forensic investigation and your own IT remediation process, right? So clients should work with your IT company, and I'm certainly, that's very important. It's all hands on deck when these kind of situations occur. If you have to, remediate and things along the lines of that nature, just make sure it's separate and apart from the privileged forensic investigation, because you want to make sure to protect that. There's been 2 recent decisions, the Clark Hill decision, the Capital One decision, to identify, but you want to be working together, because basic facts devoid of opinion are not privileged, right? But internal investigations, and just keeping in mind that if you're providing that information to anybody outside of the organization, any third party, it breaks the privilege associated with it. So again, it's things to be keeping in mind, but it's also ones that we want to encourage and think about when the process is ongoing.
Thanks, Carolyn. Georgina, shall we call up our final poll results then on that note of how important exercising is and see where we stand? Okay, so it looks like the majority of our audience does very rigorous and realistic exercising, which is excellent. 9% don't do them at all. 9% couldn't be more prepared if they tried. And then 35% not very rigorous and realistic. But it's encouraging to see that the majority of the audience understand the importance of exercising. I want to close with one more question, perhaps posed to you, John Gracey, which is, how does an organization's culture come into play when an incident hits? I think you touched on that earlier, and I think it'll be a nice one to wrap up. And then after that, we'll head on to some Q&A before closing the session.
Culture is driven by leadership, and if there's a blame culture within an organization, that encourages silence. Silence can take a bad situation and make it into a terrible situation. So you really do need to have your culture needs to be one where when someone thinks that something's happened, if someone thinks that they've clicked on a phishing link, that they know that contacting their security team is going to improve the situation. It's not going to make it worse for the company. So I think that we've mentioned training, we've mentioned a lot of other things that give people the confidence to do that, but it really comes down to leadership and making sure that staff, employees, vendors, everyone associated with your organization feel that they can approach security, that they can report, that they can be open and honest, because anything else is just going to, it's going to be disastrous if something happens.
Great, thank you, John. Right, we have 10 minutes to spare for some questions. So thank you all of you for your insights. I want to remind the audience that you can post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we will go through them and read them out. There are a few already in the system. So I will start with one that's really relevant to the topic of discussion that we've just completed, which is, for a small to medium company, how do you approach security training in a practical manner within the organization? So I imagine perhaps this is from one of the audience members who doesn't practice as rigorously as we've encouraged. How would you get started in setting up a training program?
So certainly there are numerous really effective computer-based training products out there. Everyone knows the importance of doing phishing simulation, phishing training, etc. Some of these products are not expensive. They can be very good. Not only will they necessarily do the cyber awareness training, they can provide social media training. They can even provide privacy training in certain regions, etc. So I would start off by talking to your IT provider, your managed service provider, or your trusted security organization, the people that do your pen tests, the people that do your dark web monitoring, etc., etc. Speak to them and see what they would recommend in terms of training. But knowing what's out there, there is absolutely no reason why any organization with any level of budget whatsoever should not have a really comprehensive security awareness training program. There really is no excuse for it.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? And there's so many different ways to get that training. There's free options as well. There's also gamifying, right? If you have the time, and maybe not for SMBs, but try to gamify it a bit and make it not check the box, right? Nobody wants to sit through an hour's worth of training. Just try to make it as interesting, as fun as possible.
Absolutely. And David, that's an excellent point. I mean, they're not always super costly. I mean, sure, you could have the Ferraris or whatever and all the endpoint protection programs that are out there and, all these wonderful things. But even simple as like removing your legacy protocols, right? Like, if there's, or even just limiting administrative access to certain things, right? Like not everybody needs access to every single file server that's out there. Multi-factor authentication. I know everybody everybody in terms of implementing that, everybody wants to cringe, and but again, thwarts a lot of those activities, and some of them are not not costly, but just incentivizing, making sure that people want to be part of the process. I mean, I know people who give away Amazon gift cards for people who don't click on phishing emails, things along the lines of that nature, which I know is half of the phishing emails that are out there. But again, just something to encourage people to be part of the process.
And it's all cultural again, Carolyn. I'm old enough to remember whenever it was decades ago, it was relatively common for people. I remember people bringing in, oh, we're going to lock your workstations after 5 minutes of inactivity. We're going to force you to type in your username and password every time you come logging in. If you go back 25 years, and people were reluctant, people were resistant to that. But nowadays, everyone knows that that's just part of what happens. Two-factor authentication, log into your desktop. There's loads of solutions out there, some really good solutions. Honestly, with the advances in sort of facial recognition and smartwatches, etc., a lot of those things, the barriers to actually the inconvenience of using those technologies are really disappearing rapidly. You simply click your watch and that's your second factor authenticated, etc. So there are lots and lots of ways, but it's really down to changing people's mindsets, that if they decide they don't want these things, then they're going to have to potentially explain to a regulator at some point why they made that call. That is a much more difficult conversation than the one having with your finance team to say, we need to buy this because of X, Y, or Z.
Thanks, John. Another question. I'd like to ask one of the CISOs on the panel, how do they prioritize their investment decisions when it comes to building their cyber capabilities between what they choose to do in-house and working with third parties? Gus, perhaps I can drop that one on you.
Yeah, surely, no. So yeah, we're in a case where situation where we actually are constrained more by people resources than dollar resources. So when we look at a major investment that we have to make, we have to decide, is this something that we can partner with someone that we trust, or that we're going to do it in-house? And the thing is that the resources that are always overloaded are not necessarily the security resources, but the other parts of the IT team that need to do the work. And so, so we make those decisions almost with everything we do. And so we have a set of projects that we've prioritized essentially from, you know, 1 to whatever. And we look at that and say, do we do it ourselves? Do we work with someone? Now, when you outsource it, you don't really outsource it. You still have to work with them. So it's not 100% offload. But in many cases, a partner can do a better job than you can. And then you have to just work with them on kind of maintaining it. And you can't forget the maintenance, because it's one thing to install a new tool or a new process, but it's the maintenance that kills you. If you can't maintain it, 3 months down the road, you're back where you were and you wasted all that money and time and goodwill of people. So that's how we treat it.
Thanks, Gus. And one more here. Is your security only as good as your third parties? How do you break this chain of exposure? Who would like to tackle that one?
That's a long answer for many of us.
This is pretty simple. This is going to be continuing for some time, and I think, you know, the SolarWinds is the most recent example of this, right? It's a supply chain thing. I mean, the Department of Defense in the U.S. has decided that the CMMC, the maturity standard, is going to be a part of all of their ongoing work. They're actually going back and changing some contracts, as I understand it, to reflect the need down the food chain to be in a more secure position. So this is going to be an evolving but constant thing, I think, over time.
Yeah, if it's not SolarWinds, I'm sure everybody's pivoted and everybody's looking and talking about TeamViewer right now, right? It's the soup of the day, right? TeamViewer is the soup of the day over the last 2 weeks. It's what's going to be next week, right? Which third party are we going to look at and decide if we want them in our environment or not?
Absolutely.
Sorry, Carolyn.
Please go.
I was going to say, I think one important thing is to have good procedures that you can explain to someone of how you're evaluating your third parties. Of course, things are going to, right? I can't even evaluate myself and say I'm not going to get attacked or compromised, right? So it's all, how do you do it with a third party? You have to have those things that you can argue to your management and your team and your regulators. Say, look, this is how we evaluate. That's the best we can do. And then if something happens, yes, something may happen. It may happen to us, it may happen to a third party, but that's a lot better than, oh, I didn't even look at them and they told me they had good security, so we went ahead with them.
Right, especially if they're holding your data. It's your data, it's your obligation. So having an understanding from a legal standpoint also is important, to understand what kind of obligations that whatever third party company has to yourself. Take a look at the indemnification, see if there's any sort of, you know, again, caps associated with it. Do they have cyber insurance? Are they required to carry it? Do they have any obligation to you that in the event that they have an incident, do they have an obligation to report to you? Do they have an obligation to share forensic information with you? Those are all very important things to be looking at when evaluating your vendors. Because ultimately, if you choose them, it's your responsibility.
We have 1 minute left, and I want to pose one more question, which has come through, which is haveibeenpawned.com a reliable place to see whether your email address has been involved in a breach? Yes, no, maybe.
No, I can answer that. Your email address has been, no matter what anybody tells you. Your data is out there. You have to react as though it is.
On that encouraging note. I want to thank you all again very, very much for joining us today. It's been a really insightful session. Thank you to our audience as well for your time. A reminder that you can download the Cyber Confidence Report, the SRM Cyber Confidence Report, on the handout section in your GoToWebinar panel. And on the screen now are my contact details in case anyone would like to get in touch to speak more about any of the topics that we've covered today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.